Welcome. In this video, I'm going to give you a brief overview of GATT Article 20, comprising the so-called general exceptions. Now, when the GATT was drafted, the objective of the contracting parties was not that free trade would prevail over any other type of public interest. And so Article 20 provides for a number of different areas of legitimate interest for members of the WTO to intervene by restricting trade in order to pursue these other goals. Now, these may be measures that are necessary to protect public morals, measures regarding the product of labor in prison camps, but they also cover a number of other interesting areas, as we're going to see. Now, when we look at Article 20, the first thing you'll notice is that the article contains chapeau, preamble, so to speak, which includes specific conditions as to measures that can be considered compliant with Article 20. And then we have a list of different possible justifications that may be pursued by members. Now, this so-called chapeau in the jurisprudence of the appellate body is aimed at preventing that even where there are seemingly legitimate reasons to intervene, that Article 20 is not used in such a way as to produce arbitrary or unjustified discrimination, as well as preventing so-called disguised restrictions of trade. Now, looking at the specific provisions in Article 20, we find that there are a number of them that I really wanted to highlight here, as they seem to be more important nowadays. And we will also be focusing in our classes on the case law regarding some of these exceptions. Now, take for instance Article 20b, whereby measures that are necessary to protect human, animal, or plant life or health may be adopted. Take Article 20d, according to which measures that are necessary to secure compliance with laws and regulations that are consistent with the GATT and the WTO law, then such measures may also be put into effect so as to secure compliance with these laws. And Article 20g, which covers measures relating to the conservation of exhaustible natural resources, if those measures are made in accordance with equivalent restrictions to domestic production or consumption. So as you can gather from this short list of different types of concerns, it's not sufficient simply to invoke one of these public interests. As you can see from the drafting of these provisions, these measures have to be, depending on the provision we're talking about, must be necessary to, or in a more fluid way, more flexible way, relating to, in the case of the conservation of natural resources. As we will see in our classes, this plays a role in terms of determining to what extent members have more or less discretion in resorting to these exceptions to otherwise prohibited measures under the GATT. To give you an example that might make the approach of Article 20 more intuitive, let me give you the example of the so-called asbestos case. Now, asbestos are fibers that were often used and are still used in some countries as part of building materials because they provide insulation against heat, fire, etc. And so these fibers were used in building materials, but in recent decades, scientific evidence came up that these materials were related to asbestos-provoked cancer. In this case, a cancer that attacks the lungs due to the accumulation of these fibers that we inhale when they are released into the atmosphere. So one of the problems with asbestos fibers is that if they're put into building materials, if these building materials break, these fibers will then disperse into the atmosphere and they may be inhaled by humans, and this will give rise to a significant risk of developing this type of lung cancer. Now, there have been different policy approaches. For instance, in Canada, Canada adopted something called controlled use. So only people with adequate training would be able to purchase and install building materials containing asbestos fibers. But there was no outright ban on the use of building materials containing asbestos fibers. Now, on the other hand, other members of the WTO, in this case France, as part of the European Union, France opted for what it called a zero-risk approach. And so France adopted a total ban on the import, but also on the placing on the market, on the production of building materials containing asbestos fibers. Now, the first issue is whether or not France's measures were in breach of GATT obligations. Now, because we're dealing here with an internal measure, with an internal regulation on the production and marketing and use of, in this case, building materials containing asbestos fibers, then this is quite clearly something that falls within the scope of Article 3, Paragraph 4, which I covered in a different video. Now, the problem here is, as you will know, Article 3, Paragraph 4 requires that the products that we're comparing, to see whether or not there's a treatment afforded to the imported product that is less favorable than the one given to the domestic product, it requires that these products be like products. And so this brings us to the issue of likeness once again. Now, in the asbestos case, the panel decided that while building materials with these specific characteristics, like being heat resistant, for instance, or fireproof in some cases, that building materials could be used interchangeably depending on whether they used asbestos fibers or other fibers that ensured the same type of heat resistance or fireproof type of characteristics. So for the panel, all these goods, that is, building materials with asbestos fibers and building materials with other fibers like PVA, cellulose, and glass fiber, they were all like products for the purposes of Article 3, Paragraph 4. Now, as you will recall, if a measure is in breach of Article 3, Paragraph 4, then you can raise a justification under Article 20. But the issue is one of who bears the burden of proof, and particularly who has to either attack a measure or to defend that measure. Now, if a measure such as this one was caught under Article 3, Paragraph 4, then it would be up to France, in this case, to prove that it had sufficient justification under Article 20. On the other hand, it was up to Canada to prove that there was discrimination. Now, in this case, for the panel, it was quite obvious that there was discrimination. And it was also quite obvious that France was justified in adopting this measure under Article 20. However, the panel decided that there was discrimination, so a breach of Article 3, Paragraph 4, and then the measure was justified under Article 20, Paragraph B. Now, the appellate body chose to go on a different path. For the appellate body, you cannot really say that products that are known through scientific evidence are known to cause cancer are like products to building materials using other fibers that we don't have scientific evidence that they are carcinogenic. So for the appellate body, these were not like products. So the fact that asbestos fibers may cause cancer is a relevant characteristic. Even though for the purposes of people installing these building materials, they can achieve the same type of heat insulation, etc., you cannot say that the risk that is intrinsic in asbestos containing building materials, that risk can be disregarded in an analysis of likeness. Now, by doing this, the appellate body provided members of the WTO with the ability to introduce the type of test that we take into account under Article 20 to bring it into Article 3. Why is this relevant? Well, because if there's no need to treat these as like products, then these measures were not discriminatory. If they're not discriminatory, there was no breach of the GATT obligations of France. If there's no breach, then France does not need to justify its measure as being required to restrain trade because of the need to protect another value. It is up to the member alleging a breach of GATT rules, in this case GATT Article 3, Paragraph 4, to show the evidence that the measure is discriminatory in a way that makes it contrary to Article 3, Paragraph 4. Now, the appellate body also went into the question of whether or not there was a public health justification for this measure. Now, recall that here, whereas Canada had adopted a risk control policy, and so controlled use was okay as far as Canadians were concerned, France opted for a much more restrictive approach, a so-called zero-risk policy. Now, the question is, what are the implications of these choices, particularly for the purposes of the chapeau of Article 20? That is to say, even if a measure is justified, it can still be shown that the measure has this arbitrary or unjustified discrimination character, or that it creates a disguised restriction of international trade. Now, in the panel report, the panel accepted that this was an issue involving a risk to human health and life, and that sufficient evidence of that was put forward. However, the issue was still whether or not this measure was necessary to protect public health, and also what was the acceptable level of risk. Was it the level of risk acceptable to Canada or the level of risk acceptable by France? Now, Canada argued that because it allows for this controlled use, that controlled use was a least restrictive approach to dealing with the risks of cancer provoked by asbestos fibers. And so the idea was, France could do like us, and this way it would not unnecessarily burden trade, international trade, by imposing this total ban. On the other hand, France pointed out, well, controlled use is still going to lead to an increase in the amount of building materials containing asbestos that will be out there, and this means that the risks associated with these fibers being released into the atmosphere, being breathed by humans and causing cancer, that these risks will increase in time. And what we decided was not that we could accept risks, it was really a zero-risk policy. As far as what new building materials are concerned, the idea was to eliminate all these new building materials containing asbestos. Now, the appellate body found it to be legitimate in this case for France, to adopt this zero-risk policy, particularly given that this was a highly risky product. Now, for the appellate body, it was legitimate for France to adopt this zero-risk policy in order to halt all the increase in this highly risky product and allowing the use of less risky products, that is, products containing building materials containing other fibers in place of asbestos-containing building materials. And so for the appellate body, this was a matter that was perfectly within the discretion of France to decide. Now, as to the issue of the reasonable availability of a WTO-consistent alternative measure, the appellate body also stated that this idea of a less restrictive trade measure, or less trade restrictive measure, has to be viewed in accordance with the values that are being protected in this case. And so in this case, the public interest that was at issue was one of the utmost importance. It was the protection of life and health of humans. It remained to be seen whether there would be an alternative measure that could still reach the same level of protection whilst being less restrictive than a total ban. And here in this case, the appellate body quite easily concluded that if the goal was to prevent any increase of risk, then the only measure that was able to achieve that result would be a ban on the introduction of new asbestos-containing fibers. Finally, the appellate body also highlighted the fact that even when there is discussion as to the scientific evidence behind this risk, particularly where risks are this high, risks, quite clear risks to human health and life, that members are not required to adopt only a consensus view in the scientific community. They have to rely on scientific evidence, but they are allowed to take a more cautionary approach because we might not know enough about these risks yet, although there is already scientific evidence that these risks exist. And so this was a major, landmark case, as it really highlighted the fact that trade does not trump over all types of interests, and that particularly when vital interests covered by Article 20 are at stake, that members will have discretion to establish high levels of protection. So, in other words, in this, if the view that there's a conflict between international trade and liberalizing trade and allowing trade on the one hand and protecting these important societal values on the other, the appellate body has made it quite clear that this is not a case where under the WTO is only concerned with international trade, with liberalizing trade, and that it wants to roll back all sorts of regulations that may restrict trade, but that do so in the name of very highly relevant public interests, and they do so in a manner that is compliant with the obligations undertaken under the GATT WTO, and in this case also with the chapeau of Article 20. And that's it for this brief presentation. We're going to work with other cases in our classes, and so I hope to see you there. Bye.